gonna try something I've never done before, which is I'm gonna use video as a means to study. So I'm currently studying the Old Testament, and I'm going through a precursor to my graduate school studies. So through my undergraduate experience, I did not study Bible. I studied psychology. So going into Masters of Divinity, sometimes it really is hard for me to shift my brain, my writing style, my understanding of the world and science and reading and all of this stuff. So as I'm studying, I need to understand that I'm not just studying to get a grade. You know, this is going to be my profession. I'm in school to become a chaplain, so I must develop a knowledge base of the Bible and of practical ways to help people in need. So for me, this experience is not just to get a grade. I really am doing my best to learn and to retain this information. So I'm currently going through an undergraduate level course through Our Daily Bread University for me as a precursor to the graduate level studies for Old Testament Orientation 1 and 2. So I just did the Old Testament Basics Introduction course on Our Daily Bread University, and I'm going through the quiz. This is for lesson 1. I'll post it on YouTube so that I have a place to watch it. I'll probably keep the video private, but at least it'll be an opportunity for me to go back and listen to myself speak out loud, think through these questions on these quizzes, and for a way for me to retain this information. So here we go. Just some facts, some things that I just learned through this course. So the Old Testament does not defend the existence of God. In fact, the Old Testament assumes that God exists. The fourth word in the entire Bible is God. The first 3 words just say, in the beginning. Boom. In the beginning what? In the beginning, God. If you're introducing a set of works, Moses, and you give us this character, this person, God, we must follow along with what you're saying and believe that there is this God person. You don't really give us much context about this God other than what comes after that, about him creating and him doing and him speaking and things happening. But the Old Testament gives us a baseline level of knowing or believing or assuming that God exists. I'm not on here to preach. Okay, this is just not how my brain works. I really am not on here to preach. The Old Testament consists of 29 books. 29 books. That's more than 1/3 of the entire Bible. So, did I say 29? Oh my gosh, it's 39. Oh, look at that. I'm so glad I'm doing this because I'm like correcting myself as the math didn't math because I know that there are 27 books in the Old Testament or in the New Testament, and if there were 29, that just would not make sense. That would not make 66. So there are 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 books in the New Testament, and of those 39 books, it is broken up in genres, and the way that the books are organized, or the canon of these books, it is broken down or broken into those categories. And there are 3 main categories or genres of these books, or styles of these writings. So the first 17, from Genesis all the way to Esther, we get a narrative of, life in those days, right? So from Genesis to Esther, 17 books, we get narrative style. They tell stories about God and about people and about God's involvement with these people, and so on and so forth. Then we have the next 5 books, which is Job to Song of Songs. We get the wisdom and poetry books. And again, this is the genre. That's the genre. So Job through Song of Songs, we get the wisdom and poetry books. Then finally, we get the books of prophecy, which ranges from Isaiah all the way to Malachi. Now, within that genre, it's broken down into major prophets and minor prophets, just about the size of their involvement, or at least the size of their books. But essentially, those are the 3, and the prophecies total 17. So there are 17 narrative books, there are 5 wisdom and poetry books, and then there are 17 books of prophecy. Moving on. So let's change that answer on my quiz, because that was not right. It is profitable to read the Old Testament for many, many reasons. But right off the bat, 2 Timothy 3:16-17 says, all scripture is God-breathed, or some translations will say is inspired by God. So we know that all scripture comes from God, and it's useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness. Why? So that the servant of God can do the good works. Okay, it equips us to do every good work that God has called us to do. So it is imperative, essential, that we read the Old Testament, because it's going to give us a deeper, more enriched understanding of who God is and what He expects of us. And, okay, spoiler alert, we're going to see the story of humanity being created, falling, being restored, falling again, and messing up time and time and time again. Yet God, with His patience, still loving and carrying along those who turn their back on Him. It is such a great story. The Old Testament should be read by every single person, but most especially the believers. Okay, don't just be on the New Testament, because you're gonna miss out on so much. Okay, so the Old Testament books, as I mentioned, are categorized. We have the different genres. We have narrative. We have the wisdom and poetry, and we have the books of prophecy. And as I mentioned, I am taking a quiz on this undergraduate level course, so I know some of the topics that I'm talking about are jumping over, but it's a whole thing. As I mentioned earlier, in 2 Timothy 3:16-17, where all scripture is inspired by God and is profitable, that book was written by none other than Paul. So Paul said that. And when he said all scripture, he was primarily referring to what we now refer to as the Old Testament. So how many books of the Old Testament tell the narrative of the Old Testament? That would be 17. Okay, so in this course, the professor, Dr. Buzel, says that the Old Testament is often a closed book to people. And the reason he said that is because not a lot of people read the Old Testament. I mean, it's heavy, okay? There's so much. It's jam-packed, and there are so many names and places and people and things that just don't make sense. It's hard to understand, which is why a lot of people just avoid it altogether. They think, there's no Jesus in it, or Jesus' name isn't even written in there in the Old Testament, so I'm a Christian, so I'm just going to look at the New Testament. But I'm telling you, if you just look at the New Testament, there are going to be a lot of things that you do not understand. They go hand in hand, okay? Really, you cannot have one without the other. It came from God. God gave us this complete work for us to really do our due diligence in making sure we learn the things of God, learn the will of God, and to do the will of God. So a lot of times people don't read the Old Testament because they think that its principles don't apply today, which it does. But they don't understand how it works. Okay, yeah. And consists of primarily of poetry. No, I'd say that the people don't understand how it works. So the Old Testament tells us what God is like. That is true. The Old Testament does tell us what God is like. We learn about Jesus in the Old Testament. True or false? So the Old Testament has 17 books that are books of prophecy. And in these prophecies, we learn about God's redemptive plan for the world. And we learn about someone called the what is my Jesus called? The righteous Redeemer, the Lamb. So many different ways of describing this sacrifice that God is preparing. And his name is Jesus. So the Old Testament does, we do learn some things about Jesus, especially in Isaiah. The Old Testament teaches us about God's standards. Yes, it does. There's a whole book of laws. I mean, the first 5 books are known as the law, or the Torah, or the Pentateuch, if we were Greek. Is that Greek or is that Hebrew? Oh my gosh. Okay, I have not gotten that far yet. I know one's Greek, one's Hebrew. I feel like Torah is Hebrew, right? That sounds Jewish. Anyway, I'm so stupid. Anyway, keep going on. It does teach us about God's standards. It does teach us about God's forgiveness of disobedience, and it does teach us about God's desire to restore his relationship with his people. So that answer would be all of the above. I'm going to finish this assessment. I'll see how I did. If I missed anything, I'll correct it here in this video. But as I mentioned, this is a great way for me to get everything out and rewatch this so that I can remember it all. So I got 10 out of 10, 100% on that assessment. So we are going to keep it moving. So that was lesson 1, Old Testament introduction. The next video I will do is lesson 2, which is the Old Testament story. And let's just look at the overview and objectives here. So it says, in lesson 2, we will study the Old Testament story and focus on the books that tell it from its beginning in Genesis to its end in Nehemiah. The story of God's love and gracious forgiveness is the core of the Old Testament literature. So the lesson objectives include, when you complete this lesson, you should be able to do the following. Describe how the color books differ from the time books. Identify the 11 books that move the story of the Old Testament forward, and then name the 4 eras or periods into which the Old Testament is divided. Man, so I'm not very good with history or timelines, but since I'm going to be taking this Old Testament Orientation 1 in graduate school, it really is important for me to at least have some foundation of the history and the timeline and all that stuff. So stay tuned. I know I'm not going to post this as public, but if I ever decide to one day, then I definitely will. But see you.